Hello and welcome to Freeman. I'm Rob Menard. I'll be your host, and thank you for joining us. We've got a pretty good show lined up for you. We've got Chief Resident Correspondent Dean Clifford going to be giving us a report from the wintry depths of Manitoba. My co-host is Angry Adrian, a good buddy of mine with a very intelligent perspective on things. Our musical guest is Gemini. I'm looking forward to that. This guy is. Well, he brings passion to his music. And our featured speaker is going to be our friends from the Idle No More movement, Chief Sino Rock. And we're going to be speaking about the Idle No More movement. Our emphasis on this series is the courts, testing them. Now, you know what's funny? Besides Caesars, because Caesars are pretty weird, aren't they? I mean, think of it. Someone's sitting there saying, I'm thirsty. I'll have some tomato juice. I'm there for you. Then they say, you know what would be good with this? Some vodka. I would agree. And then someone went, it's still missing something. Here, let's put some Tabasco sauce in it. Give it a bit of kick. I'm down for that. And then, there's some Worcestershire sauce. I'm going to put that in too because that makes everything better. I want some salt. Oh, there's only celery salt. Still missing something. Hey, I know. Clam juice. Who in the name of Saint Fuck thought up that? That to me is very weird. But that's neither here nor there, and it has absolutely nothing to do with this podcast, so let's just carry on. What's weird to me is the fact that criticizing the executive and legislative branch of the government is to Canadians right up there with beer and hockey, and there's no way you can remove that. Yet there are people in the judiciary who try to claim that us questioning their authority or questioning the way they operate, criticizing them, well, you try doing that outside of a courthouse with a great big sign and you watch them bring the hammer down on you and they will charge you with contempt of court. Apparently, the courts, you're not allowed to criticize them. So guess what I'm going to be doing? To me, one of the problems is with this whole Freeman movement is not really the Freeman movement being the problem, but the way it's being presented in the newspapers and in the media and even by the courts. A lot of people argue, and these are the authoritarians, they say, well, the courts, no court has ever ruled in your favor. And they ignore the thousands and thousands of cases which get dropped, and therefore there is no ruling because of what the free men do. People who claim that you're only right if the court agrees with you fail to factor in the fundamental truth that we have our own hearts, we have our own minds, we can make up our own decisions. To me, it's kind of like a multimeter. If you're testing an electronic circuit with a multimeter, and the multimeter reads 0 volts, and then you touch it and you get a shock, are you going to ignore your own senses and say, oh, well, this multimeter is right, it's always right, we can't question it, therefore I must not be feeling a shock? That makes no sense to me. And the Freeman perspective, it resonates so strongly with people's spirits and their conscience that you can't deny it. And to claim that it doesn't exist because a court refuses to rule in our favor, that makes me wonder whether or not the courts are in fact broken. Who's to say that they're not corrupt, that they haven't been hijacked, that they're not corroded, that they can't be recalibrated and recharged? Now, if we are going to be questioning it, one of the reasons is because there's a guy by the name of J.D. Rook. And J.D. Rook is an Associate Chief Justice in the Court of Queen's Bench in Alberta. He released a ruling, Meads versus Meads, and in it he took the time out to assemble about 175 pages of a running diatribe against the Freeman movement. Now, in this diatribe of the movement, even although there was no evidence presented to support his reasons and his findings, he decided to call myself and a number of other people gurus, conmen, and parasites. Now, this is a little troubling to me that this is extending from a guy sitting on a bench. I was given no notice that this was going to be decided. I was given no opportunity to defend, and I'm pretty sure my name wasn't even mentioned in the transcripts at all. Now, this is an abuse of his process. And we'll hold off on that. Remember his name, though, J.D. Rook, the Associate Chief Justice, Court of Queen's Bench, Mead versus Mead. Look it up, read it. It's quite shocking. He comes out and it's such an abuse of his position and his authority. And it is essentially him trying to chill public dissent of the courts and how they operate. Now, I'm going to shine a light for a moment. We're going to digress a little bit. You'll see why in a moment. I'm going to shine a light on one of the more idiotic corners of the internet. It's called the Randy Forum. I call them Randyites. Now, this is a forum of authoritarian-loving pay-and-obey crowds, whether or not they are actually involved in the government and therefore make money off of it or defend it. They have been attacking me and calling me, coincidentally enough, conmen, parasites, and a guru. The first time I was ever referred to as a guru was on that website. Now, I'm going to bring it to your attention because I am suing 3 people from that website. Now, this is not for what they posted on their forum. This is what their forum is kind of like.
I'm special!
Like that. But because they started sending emails out off the forum and into the real world, and they're sending emails to venues that I'm renting in order to present my perspective and share my beliefs. They're seeking to silence me, not by addressing the beliefs and countering them, but by attacking the character of the people who present them. They use ad hominems. It's funny, you go to the Randyites forum. Now, James Randi, the guy who set up this educational foundation, they consider themselves critical thinkers, skeptics. Yet they are not skeptical at all of anything which they already hold as truth, and their idea of debunking your beliefs involves insulting you personally until you leave, and then they think they've debunked you successfully. They love their authority. They just love the authority, and their claim is, unless a court rules in your favor, it can't be true. And they failed to factor in that maybe the problem is the courts. To me, it's kind of like going to a Hell's Angel. If you were being subjected to extortion by a motorcycle club and you wanted remedy from it and you're saying you're not allowed to do this, and they said, really? Come talk to our judge and see what he has to say. Clearly, it would not be accepted as lawful and just. Now, the courts claim that they are independent and impartial. But are they really? We're going to have to test that. Now, the funny thing about the Randy forum is I'm going after 3 guys in particular: A Raider, Jargon Buster, and a guy who goes by the name of Drock. Now, A Raider, he's an old, lonely guy. This guy, the way his mind works, it's kind of sad. I'll give you a for instance. Oh, and incidentally, this guy knows that I'm trying to find out who he is and so I can serve him documents. And he's just playing a silly bugger game, and like the coward he is, he refuses to identify himself. I once recounted the true story of being in West Vancouver, sitting and drinking a beer, having a cop come, talk to me, and then walking away, leaving me with my beer. I then met a guy in Windsor, Ontario, and this guy, pretty much the same thing happened to him. He was walking down the street, cops came, talked to him, found out he was a Freeman, and let him go. A Raider took these 2 stories and claimed that I was mixing it up. This was, to him, proof that the first story was a lie because I didn't get the details right in the second story. The idea that there were 2 people, 2 beers, 2 separate cities, 2 separate situations responded to similarly by 2 separate cops, that was not even on the table of contemplation. Nope, to him, it was proof that I was lying the first time. That's how his brain works. These people go out of their way to attack the people who have opinions different from them. They don't raise valid points against the arguments at all. And test it yourself. Set up an account there, go there, and then just attack the Freemen. Do it frothing at the mouth blindingly, and you watch how they support you. James Randi has a challenge, $1 million for anyone who has psychic abilities and who can prove it. And on there, they often make claims to know what other people are thinking or believing, and these go unquestioned. Now, there's 3 of them who I'm going after: Jargon Buster, A-Raider, Drock. Here's the funny thing. What if there is a link? What if there's a 4th person? And what if I can establish that there is a link between these 3 and this 4th person? Definitely showing collusion, communication, perhaps conspiracy. And what if that 4th person is in fact Justice J.D. Rook of the Associate Chief Justice of the Court of Queen's Bench in Alberta? What if this man is in fact either familially related to Drock or is in fact Drock himself? I mean, J.D. Rook. Erase that. Guess what you get? Drock. And here's the thing. I know when I'm being tag teamed. The guy comes out, calls me a con man, a parasite, and a guru. Exactly what they've been calling me on the Randi forum. Then, in his reasons, he specifically mentions the Randi forum. And then Drock posts this on the internet, explaining and implying that he has inside knowledge of how and why these things were written. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm bringing legal action. I am now including Drock and the number 4, and I am bringing action against the judge, against J.D. Rook. And I'm including him in this. Now here's what's going to happen. He's either going to try to claim, and bear in mind, this is a test of him. If this man is corrupt, if he is involved in a conspiracy or collusion to defame, and the charges stand against these 3 because they're clearly untrue, malicious, and defamatory, and this guy has been saying the exact same thing about me, but from doing it from a bench, there's 2 defenses which he would likely try. If he wants to try the first one, go ahead. It's called truth. Go ahead, step up and try to prove that your claims, let him try to prove that his claims of me being a con man, a parasite, and a guru are true. If he can't do that, then he's lying and he is wrong from the bench, and that case should never be brought up by any other jurist in Canada, especially if there is a link between him and these 3 people, because now he is shat all over his bench. Who the hell can trust this guy when he is going off and engaging in what are clearly abuse of his office in order to win internet arguments on the short bus forums? The other defense that he might like to try, and if he tries this one, this to me is proof positive that he is a corrupt individual. He needs to be replaced or removed from the bench, and his emails should be examined to see what sort of communication was being engaged in between him and these 3, and whether or not he actually allowed other people to write his reasons or portions of his reasons, because if that's the case, he should be off the bench. Here's the thing that he'll likely end up trying. It's called qualified privilege. Now, qualified privilege is a defense against the bringing of charges of defamation. It's applicable within a court and for court participants because it's recognized that court is an adversarial relationship. Things can get heated in there, and during the course of the trial, things that are said, even if they were maliciously intended, are not grounds for defamation. Now this makes sense to me You get people get hot and angry at each other. They feel dishonored. They feel frustrated, and a lot of times people will lash out. But it has to operate within the court system. Here's the judge. Here's the defendant and the plaintiff, and it has to be between these three people or a witness maybe. But it has to operate within the court, during the course of the proceedings of the court, and it has to be between these guys. If he tries claiming qualified privilege first, this means he's not trying to use truth, so therefore he knows that what he was saying from the bench was complete fabrications, lies essentially, and he's lying from the bench, so who the hell can trust him after that? And if he tries using qualified privilege, bear in mind the people bringing the action, moi, was outside that court, and it wasn't even during the course of events, it was after the events, months later, after careful recollection or careful consideration. Months later, this judge decided to defame someone who wasn't even a part of it, and the proceedings had ended. Now, if he tries to claim qualified privilege and the courts recognize that and grant it, then that means that while I'm bringing action against A-Raider, Jargon Buster, and Rock, and that's me, that means I can say whatever the hell I want to say about that judge and there's about J.D. Rook, and there's nothing he can do about it. It means I can go outside after the court case, stand outside in the court, in front of the courthouse, passing out pamphlets clearly defaming some other party who's not even a part of this, and claim that I am protected from charges of defamation because it's in the course of events of a trial, that there's a trial ongoing, and therefore I'm free to say whatever the hell I want about anyone I want, wherever I want. If what this judge did is in fact covered by qualified privilege, then that is further evidence of their corruption. It's an abuse of office, and if he can do it, then anyone within that court can do it. And it means that after the trial, after the gavel has come down, after all the witnesses have been called, that people can go out and defame third parties with impunity. That's why I started with the Randy Forum, the short bus of the internet. Now, this is an open invitation to A-Raider, Drock, or Jargon Buster. Call in, identify yourself. Come on, don't be cowards. Call in, identify yourself. You've been challenging me long enough. I want to meet you in court. Let's meet in court. Let's get it on, bitches. But I bet you won't, because you're fucking cowards. And you know it. Now, when you look at it, we've been called a whole lot of nasty things, and they're trying to label us as anti-government extremists, domestic terrorists, potentially violent assholes, freeloaders, conmen, parasites, gurus. But when you look at it, really, what are we doing? Now, we're told in Canada, if you want to change the system, you must operate within the system. What do the Freemen do? What are we using? Words. We're not using swords, we're not using guns, we're not using explosives, we're not doing anything except using words in court and out of court. We're operating within the system and using peaceful means. Now this, the government does not like, and this is what they're complaining about. We're studying their words, understanding what they've been doing, and then using our own to counter them. And now they want to claim, oh, you can operate within the system, but limited to how we say. But there's something else that the Freemen are doing, which really causes the people in the government concern. Probably a lot more than us using words. They'll scream about this and call us paper terrorists and try to mention that it's all gobbledygook, when all it is notices and claims and using their language. There's something else that we're doing, or not doing more accurately, which they are really truly fearful of because they never mention it. And that, what we're doing, is we are refusing to sign and accept their words. We refuse to sign documents with the words registration, application, submission. We believe that these documents actually create the trust and the relationship which allows them to then claim the right to govern. It's not they have the right to govern automatically and therefore we're obliged to fill out their documents. They don't like that at all. And I can tell because they don't mention it, not even a little bit. They scream about the thing that causes them the least concern, and they are completely silent about that which is actually the most disempowering for them. So my question is, this is Canada. Why are they so upset about people using words within the system and refusing to sign their documents? If what they're selling is such a great thing, why do they need so much deception and deceit in order to get people to buy it? And why do they try to respond so aggressively when we refuse to do so any longer? The Freemen are not a threat to the people of Canada. We're not a threat to Canada. If anything, we're a threat to the deception routinely employed and relied upon by those who have seized authority over us. We're a threat to the corporate hold on the system of government that we have now. We're a threat to false claims of authority. And because we believe so strongly in love, compassion, and truth, we're a complete threat, an absolute threat, to deception itself and to fictions in law. Where there is truth, there can be no fiction. Fiction is the darkness, truth is the light. You shine the light, the darkness is gone. And the truth of the matter is, all of these fictions, they're rapidly fading away in importance and in acceptability to your average human being. I think that's the line that really defines who the Freemen are against other Canadians. And bear in mind, the Freemen, they come from every walk of life within Canada. We've been called racist, we've been called anti-Semitic, all sorts of things, but the fact is, our ranks are filled with people from all walks of life. We invite everyone. Once you get here, you understand why we laugh at the idea that we're racist. Because we recognize we're all just bald monkeys on a rock in space. And none of us have any inherent rights. None of us chose what our heritage or our culture is. Myself, I'm French, Scottish, Irish, and German. And likely a little bit of Iroquois mixed in. But the French, Scottish, Irish, and German, I mean, it's just a coincidence that that just happens to be the very best mixture ever devised in the history of the world, and that everyone else sucks because of it. It's just a coincidence. No, man, no one chose. No one got a say in what body they were going to inhabit when we came down. The idea that any one body or metamorphic type is better than another is ludicrous. And the Freemen, we laugh at the claims or the labels when they try to stick those silly ones on us. What we're looking at doing is simply exercising the rights and the freedoms that previous generations fought, killed, and died for so that they are available for future generations. And to us, we see that as a duty. We have a duty to do that. We have a duty to operate within the framework, which is the law, which means using words. It means we have a duty to step up and exercise our rights, including the rights to refuse to sign their documents and accept their services. And it means that we have a duty to build something better. And I hope we can do that with this show. I want to digress for a moment and read for you this, was in an op-ed piece, Fundamental Rights, written by Brendan Shields of Vancouver. Brendan is a public sector worker, and I'll read off his letter, Fundamental Rights. As a public sector worker, I take great issue with the guest column by Brian Lee Crowley. I don't care if you work in private, public, or a non-union environment. The right to withdraw your services is fundamental to a fair and equitable workplace. It is the only way to create leverage with an employer during a conflict. If the right to strike didn't exist, what would motivate any employer to talk with us? Crowley's attack on public sector unionized workers is just another in a long litany of attacks on the public sector. He needs to remember, as does everyone, that we all depend on public sector workers and the expertise they bring to their fields. I would agree with Brendan, but I wonder if he would agree with me. I agree that it is a fundamental right. The right to withdraw your services is fundamental, but also the right to refuse these services. I'd be willing to bet that Brendan is one of these public service workers who believes that it's okay for him to withdraw his services because he doesn't consent to it, but when it comes to providing services, he gets to impose it on members of the public without any consent. If it is fundamental to him to be able to withdraw services, then it must be, the flip side of that must be that we have the fundamental right to refuse his services. And I'm not talking about the majority have decided, so they impose their will on the others. I'm talking about the individual recipients. And I don't care whether or not you're a police officer, a property inspector, business bylaw enforcer, a social worker trying to provide services to our children, a court worker trying to provide adjudication services. If we cannot say no to your services, they're no longer services. It's an imposition of tyranny at the point of a gun. So I wonder whether or not Brendan believes that we have the right to say, no, thank you, we don't want your services, get off my property. I wonder if he believes that like I do. Hi, folks. Now, in order for any society, any community to function properly, there is a requirement for discussion. There has to be a dialogue happening. People have to be free to express ideas and problems. There are, however, those, and I'm a firm believer in that, and at the very least, even if the Freeman movement, even if the ideas prove to be completely wrong, and I know they're not, even if they are, at least it has initiated and instigated a greater level of discussion within our societal structure, and that can't be a bad thing. But there are apparently those who do not want to see discussion of certain topics engaged in. It would seem that those who love authority, whether it's the exercise thereof or its apparent protection, they do not want discussion concerning the source, nature, and limits of authority, and they will go way out of their way to attempt to destroy any discussion along those lines. They use what's called neuro-linguistic programming discussion destruction tactics. And these are basic techniques, and what we're going to do is examine these techniques and see what they're doing. Now, I'm going to draw your attention once again to the silly corner of the internet, the Randiate forum. And we will examine and look at what they're doing there. And you'll see the reason I'm doing this is because the tactics they employ is exactly the same that mainstream media employs when dealing with the Freemen and trying to paint us into a negative picture as well. And in order to be able to defeat these tactics, you have to understand what they are and you have to recognize them when they're being employed. Now, the first tactic that they employ, this is their big stick that they like to swing all the time. In order to destroy discussion about ideas, what they will always do is they try to shift the discussion onto the character of their opponent. And they seek character assassination and ad hominems. Instead of addressing the argument presented, they attack the character, the reputation of the one presenting. That's their one big one. You can see it on the Randy forum, where essentially all they do is talk about me and my reputation, and they claim to know me well enough to judge me, and then they make outlandish claims about me. And then they bat those ideas back and forth, and it becomes truth to them after a certain amount of time. They like to limit choices. On the Randy forum, when they opened up this thread, the very first one, it was initially titled Rob Menard, Con Man or Clown. So those are your two choices, both of which are insulting to the reputation. The one that wasn't available was, hey, is there any merit to his argument? Because, rule number one, they have to avoid the argument. And the reason is because when people start to understand what the true philosophy of the free man is, it starts to resonate with their hearts. They recognize it as truth. And you can't discuss these concepts without risking having them being accepted by the people who are discussing them. So their weakness is they have to avoid the discussion. What they like to do in order to support their ad hominems, they will reject anything which is positive towards the character of the other party and automatically latch on to anything which can be deemed to be detrimental to their reputation or their character. If they had a number of different options, let's look at why something didn't happen. Could be a number of different options. Other opportunities presented themselves, people changed their mind, it was harder than originally anticipated, the money didn't show up, the loan fell through. All of these are potential reasons why it could happen, and they're innocuous, and they're not, they don't shine a negative light on anyone. And then they will pick up, and all of these might be incredibly likely, they might actually be what happened, but they will pick up on the one that's least likely, and that being that guy's a con man. Yeah, there's a conspiracy to defraud the people. And they will claim this one, reject all of these, even though these make much more sense, are more likely, and in fact did happen, and this one is unsupported by any facts, any evidence, anything. But they will latch on to that one. They do that all the time. They also like to extend ludicrous challenges. Now, I'm suing three of them, A-Rater, Jargon Buster, and Duroc, in the Supreme Court of British Columbia. This is a lawful challenge to them. They reject that and they ignore it and gloss over it, or they'll mock it and make fun of it. And then they will extend a ludicrous challenge on their own. A-Rater had this to say, extended this challenge. He wants me essentially to reveal publicly personal information to him, and bear in mind he's hiding his own identity. He no idea who he is. And if I refuse to release personal information publicly, then that means I'm a con man. Now this is a challenge that no one in their right mind would accept for any reason. You have no obligation to do such a thing, but my failure to do it is evidence to him that I am a con man and that I have egg on my face. So they like to extend the ludicrous challenges while ignoring lawful proper challenges. If they want to meet me in public and have a debate on stage about the ideas and the philosophies presented and held by the Freeman, that's one thing. He, however, wants to hide behind the internet, hide his identity like a coward, and demand that I release personal information to the world. Well, he hides who he is. That's the ludicrous challenge that they like to extend. And they will use your refusal to accept their ludicrous challenges as evidence of a win on their part, apparently. Now, one of the big things that you will notice about these people and about the neurolinguistic programming discussion destruction tactics is their love of authority. They will defend it vehemently. They will defend it, they will do so blindly, and they will defer to it, and they'll do so ignorantly without even aware of it. Their entire argument, and you can see this on the Randiate forum, you can see it in mainstream media, the entire argument, what it boils down to, if you try saying, well, what about this, what about this? Oh, none of that matters. No judge has accepted it. And that's their argument. That's their go-to argument. They go to it all the time because if no judge has accepted it, clearly it can't be right. That multimeter says there's no voltage there. No, touch it. You can feel a shock. No, I'm not touching it. I believe what the multimeter says. Look, there's energy there. Feel it. Nope, not touching it. The multimeter says no. That's their mindset. When we question the authority of the judges to render their decisions, they point to the judge rendering a decision that he has that authority. I'll let that sink in there for a moment. They love the authority either because they exercise it over others, they are part of the machine, they get paid from it, and they are defending it for that reason, or they are fearful of what their fellow man might do if they enjoyed a higher level of freedom, mostly because they do not recognize within themselves the responsibility required to properly exercise that greater degree of freedom. So they're fearful of anyone with that freedom, and they like the false sense of security that this false authority seems to give them. The other big thing about them that you'll notice, and you'll really see this on the Randy forum, is that they are cowards. These people who want to talk bad about the gurus of the movement, they use labels to avoid the discussion. They try to discount the beliefs by attacking the character and the reputation of the one presenting it. If you go to the Randy forum, essentially what you'll see is A-Raider and Jargon Buster jacking each other off. That's pretty much what it looks like. They're cowards. They will not identify themselves, and yet they will attack from the anonymity of the internet. They know that there's legal action pending against them, and instead of identifying themselves and manning up, they've got clocks running, counting down, apparently, according to A-Raider, the fact that he refuses to identify himself so that service can be effected on him. That is him frustrating service, so it takes longer for me to get the documents to him, because first I have to know who the hell he is. Because I don't know who he is, I have to go through another process to figure out that information. That can cost thousands of dollars. And this guy's got a running clock, all proud of himself because of the fact that he is the one who lacks the legal, moral, and ethical standing and character to identify himself and meet me in court and accept that challenge. And you'll find that this is what they are like. These people who blindly support the authoritarian structure do so from the shadows because they are cowards. You'll also notice, and here's an example of this, and you'll find it in the mainstream media as well as reflected here in the Randy forum. You will find that their actions seek to divide. Their actions are divisive. They have to try to separate the people from each other, and they have to try to play one off against each other. And in the Randy forum, Jargon Buster is purposely putting stuff up in the hopes that people who go there and read it will be less likely to give any credence to my beliefs because of the attacks he's made on my person. Now the other thing, here's one of their other big ones, I think. It's right up there with the ad hominem attacks. It's an out-and-out lie. They just lie outrageously. They will take a story, twist it completely 180 degrees, and then present that as the truth. And what's funny on the Randy forum, these guys consider themselves to be critical thinkers, skeptics, and deep thinkers. And they will accept any of this without question. They just eat it right up. Here's an example I'll give you from the Randy forum as well. Here's the words that Jargon Buster had to say. Wow, Menard's a class act, isn't he? At 3 minutes, he's breaking an elderly woman's arm and neck and throwing her to the floor. You go, Wolverine. What a guy. Apparently, there's some reason to believe that I'm into needlessly attacking elderly women. So what led to this? What is he presenting? Now let's look at the actual tape and understand exactly what he's referring to. Toronto, back in 2010. And here we have crazy cop lady. Now this is the person that Jargon Buster refers to as an elderly woman. Now, bear in mind, he's attempting to plant into the public psyche that I'm a man who would beat upon an elderly woman, apparently unprovoked attack, break her arm, break her neck, and throw her to the ground. That's what his implication was. Would you have the right to defend yourself against this woman? If you see what I mean? Defending myself, saying that I would defend myself against a 35-year-old armed police officer unlawfully attacking me with a baton, clearly with intent to hurt me, saying that I would defend myself, likely the military training that I had would kick in, I would break her arm and smack her head off the ground. That's what I was trained to do. That's likely how I would respond in a situation like that. That becomes, in their mind, unprovoked assault on an elderly woman. They take something, twist it completely, present that, and now what'll happen is him and A-Rater on the jargon on the Randy forum, they will bounce this back and forth until it becomes solidified in the mindset of the people reading it, and then later on others will just mention it like it's a given fact now. This is how they operate, and they do the same thing in the mainstream media on a much larger scale. Now, the other thing you'll notice that they like to do is they will employ straw man arguments. This is where they present a perversion of the beliefs, try to assign those beliefs as their opponents, and then attack those. They create the thing they argue against. What they like to do is twist what the reality is into something that they can then attack. In the mainstream media, you see them refer to us all the time as what? Anti-government. And that is nowhere near the truth. It's actually a complete lie. What we are is pro-good government and anti-government corruption. But by leaving out that one word, they change completely what our perspectives are, and then they ask us to defend these anti-government beliefs when they were never ours to begin with. And then they argue about how good government is, and how without it we'd all be living in caves. So they like to create these straw man arguments, and you'll see it also on the Randy It forum, where one guy will say something, claim that that's my belief. For instance, I imagine they're doing it with this court case. I'm using the courts. I'm bringing action to bear against them. Their beliefs will be, they'll try claiming, oh, Menard said courts have no authority, and therefore he can't use them himself. And I never said that they had no authority. My belief is that they are being abused, that they've been hijacked by the law societies and being abused by the governments, and that they do require consent to engage in their actions. And 1,000-year-old fictions don't empower them. This is presented as a complete and absolute rejection of the courts entirely. And that's not my perspective at all. It never has been. And yet they will now try to claim that that is my perspective, and therefore me using the courts is an abandonment of my core principles. They misrepresent my principles and then claim that my actions are contrary to those misrepresented principles. And you'll find that they do the same thing in the mainstream media. And this is the fundamental one that I notice mostly on the Randy forum. They're going to love this, I'm sure, but you'll also see it used in the mainstream media as well. And that is, they are childish. They engage in childish actions. They try to push buttons and insult. One guy, A-Rater, his big kick is apparently that I'm a narcissist, so he'll mention that whatever chance he gets. He apparently has daddy issues because he likes to think that that's going to affect me, and he talks about my relationship with my father all the time. Their actions are childish and immature, but they're done so purposely. And the reason is, bear in mind what the entire purpose of all this was to begin with. The reason is they want to stop discussion. They do not want the ideas shared. They do not want these things discussed either between them, with them, and they don't want us discussing it with other people who aren't them. So they go well out of their way to try to limit the exchange of ideas because these ideas threaten their accepted paradigm of this authority, of the state as authority. These fictional entities that they cling to. To me, they're like children who believe in Santa Claus and who refuse to accept that Santa Claus is just a fiction, an imaginary construct, because they want to keep getting their presents. So, and if you don't believe me that I'm telling the truth with all this, check out the Randiate forum, set up an account there, and attack me, go nuts, attack my character without any proof whatsoever. Watch how they lap it up. They won't ask for any proof whatsoever. Have your friend or set up another account on a different IP using a different email address. Claim that you had a win in court, that the charges were dismissed using the Freeman stuff. They will start demanding proof, and if there is no court record, if the judge doesn't come out and say, yes, you're right, then they claim it didn't happen. And you'll watch the double standards that they themselves seem to be blind to, but they embrace it and apply it like you wouldn't believe. But they're completely blind to it. I think it's cognitive dissonance. They have been supportive of the authoritarian state structure for so long. They either rely on it for their food stamps, like A-Rater likely does, or they enjoy the authority it grants them, like Duroc does, and they do not want to examine anything which would question that structure. And they don't want the public discussing these ideas either, and that's why they go through so much energy, they expend so much time and energy trying to attack the character and the reputation of the people who are presenting this information. That's why they are presenting us as anti-government. It's a 180-degree flip of what we actually are. We're pro-good government. But could you imagine them presenting? A growing group of Canadians are lawfully rejecting what they see as corrupt government. Who's going to argue with that? Our group would be growing pretty quick if they actually presented us properly as how we present ourselves, but they can't do that, and they know it. And that's why they use lies. They use outright lies, and they use all of these techniques we've been discussing in order to try to destroy any chance of proper discussion. Because it is this discussion which, if the people engaged in, would truly destroy their claim and their claim to authority and their power. That's why people on the Randy forum act so childishly all the time. It frustrates discussion. It makes adult discussion impossible. And even if you do get past that and you try to have a discussion with these folks, it will boil down to their love of authority. They will claim that unless a judge agrees with you, it's not right, it's not true. The idea that the judge could be part of the problem, that the corrosion within the system could be so systemic as to reach some of these judges, that is, you can't even look at that. No, they don't want to examine the source, nature, and limits of the judge's authority. They just want to bow to it. Now, the second test that we're going to do, part 2 of this series, is going to deal with the courts themselves. Question is, have they been hijacked? And we will test this by seeking a judicial review of one act, one section of one act, what it means, and the application of that act. I'm referring to the Legal Profession Act and Section 1, Application of the Act. Here's what it says. It essentially states that it is not applicable against lawyers if they are acting as a judicial justice of the peace. The question is it applicable against everyone? The Law Society routinely uses that act to secure court orders barring people from engaging in certain actions. And the Law Society claims that they need a monopoly on the courts to protect the public from those people who are incapable of interpreting acts properly. Now, if I'm right and they're wrong, that means their entire argument is shot right out of the water. It means that they're either incapable of interpreting these acts, or they are, and they are seriously corrupt and they've known about it the whole time. The head of the law societies. These people must realize the limitations of this act. And when you look at it, this is one of the problems. In a section titled Application of the Act, they don't clearly state who it's applicable to. They very ambiguously tell you who it's not applicable to. Now the question is it only applicable to lawyers unless those lawyers are acting as a judicial justice of the peace, or is it applicable to everyone and only lawyers acting as a judicial justice of the peace are excluded? I see the courts are going to only have three options. They can either refuse to rule on it, in which case the appearance of corruption on their part is very high, and we can, based on that, just say, thank you very much, we won't be requiring any of your services anymore. And clearly we have a right to answers, we have a right to justice, and you're denying it, so we don't need your courts anymore. Or they rule in favor of the Law Society and claim that it's applicable to everyone. Here's the problem with that. They also want to claim that they're independent and impartial. And not all judicial justices of the peace are drawn from the Law Society. So if they find in favor of the Law Society and claim that it's applicable to everyone who is not specifically mentioned, then it becomes applicable to judicial justices of the peace not drawn from the Law Society. And that means that their claim of being impartial and independent is shot right out of the water. They can't claim that they're independent and impartial when some judicial justices of the peace are burdened by this act and others aren't, and the only difference between them is that some of them are drawn from the Law Society. That right there is a crack in their structure which can be used to destroy their structure entirely. The only thing that makes sense is that it's only applicable against people if they're members of the Law Society first and foremost, and then it is no longer applicable when they're acting as a judicial justice of the peace. Now let's take it, it's called the Legal Profession Act, let's call it the Professional Hockey Players Act, and then have the application say this act is not applicable to professional hockey players if they are acting as a referee in a proper game. It's very clear based on that it's not applicable to everyone. If you and your boys get together and you start having a pickup game of hockey and a professional hockey player comes by and says, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to do that because we have these rules that we follow and you have to follow them too. You'd be able to point out and say, listen, it says Professional Hockey Player Act. I'm not a Professional Hockey Player Act. And the opposite of the statement, this act is not applicable to hockey players if they are, to professional hockey players if they are acting as a referee. The opposite of that isn't everyone else. The opposite of this statement, when they say in the Legal Profession Act, when they say it is not applicable to lawyers who are acting as judicial justices of the peace, the opposite isn't the opposite of lawyer. It's this act is not or is applicable to lawyers who are not operating as a justice of the peace. Put the word not somewhere in there and you will get a picture of who it is actually applicable to. That act is only applicable to the Law Society. That's what I'm going to be claiming. And I'm pretty sure I can prove it. And if the court rules against me, they shoot themselves in the foot and they can never again claim that they are independent and impartial. And if they try reading more into it, if they say, okay, well, we find that it's applicable against everyone and the legislature just forgot to mention judicial justices of the peace not drawn from the law profession, so we're going to include them anyways. Now they have to read two things into it to get back to where they would be had they not read anything into it to begin with. And that right there is also evidence of corruption within those courts. So we're going to seek a judicial determination to see whether or not they rule in favor of it being applicable only to lawyers or in favor of it being applicable to everyone. If they claim it's only applicable to lawyers, That's pretty much clear evidence that the Law Society of British Columbia has been operating corruptly and incompetently for many, 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 many years. If they rule in favor of the Law Society, they can no longer claim that they are independent and impartial, because some judicial justices are bound by that act and some are not. That little crack right there is what will end up being the downfall of their entire system. So that's what I want to test with that one. You know, I've had some people ask me why do this. They think I'm focusing too much on the Randy Forum and JB and A-Raider and Drock. The thing is, they say don't feed the trolls, but it's not just trolling when it's no longer limiting their comments to an internet forum, but are actively speaking to people not on that forum, outside of it, stalking me, hunting me down, and harassing people who are friends, family, and business associates. I think there's a big difference to that. I think JB's actions are clearly the actions of a sociopath, and he needs to be identified, and the people around him need to know what he's been doing. They need to know that he decided on the spur of a moment to destroy a fellow human being for no other reason than that human being didn't answer his questions, and that he then focused an enormous amount of time over 3 years to that goal. They need to know about this. The people around him are potentially in danger. The guy is clearly The other reason is I want to try to find my voice here for my podcast, and speaking to a camera without any audience there is a little bit disconcerting. It's not a natural thing to do, and it feels a little bit weird, so I want to be able to find my voice and lubricate it, get it happening out there. And of course, the fundamental goal is to help create a better Canada and a better world. And I think by examining the actions of these Randy members, the Randy at Forum people, I can establish a number of things. One, that they have been engaging in unlawful, tortuous defamation, and that leads to the judge, J.D. Rook, the Associate Chief Justice, and that allows me to now bring action to bear against him, and he's really the one that I want to address. But I have to go through the Randy Forum in order to establish that he was in fact involved with a previous and an ongoing tortuous action of defamation. It was a conspiracy to defame, which he joined in to after the fact from the bench, and he used his bench to do it. So I want to highlight that, and I think that opens the door to testing the courts itself. Now bear in mind, I don't want to test the court's patience. My purpose here is not to attack the courts. I think they've been hijacked, and I think what the people who have hijacked it are going to try to do is paint us as attacking the courts so that the courts are fearful of our actions. But I don't think that's the case at all. They shouldn't fear us. We love the law, and all we're seeking to do is to loosen the grip that the law societies apparently have on it. Now, what I've done is under the research, I came across an act, and I think this act is probably key to the entire thing. It's this act which the Law Society uses in order to maintain their monopoly upon the courts. It is that monopoly upon the courts which is then further abused to deny us all sorts of remedy which should be ours at law. The courts should belong to the people, and yet the Law Society has apparently deemed it that we're not allowed to use it to the degree they are. There's one particular act. It's a rather arcane and innocuous act. Most people would never read it. And it establishes the relationship which exists between the public and the Law Society. It's called the Legal Profession Act, and Section 1 of the Legal Profession Act is essentially, the way I look at it, the act itself, it's like a whip. And a whip has a handle and a point that causes pain. And someone is holding that whip, and the other person is going to be subjected to the pain. They have decided that they hold the handle because of this act and because of this section. Now what we're going to do is examine this section. Now bear in mind, when it comes to testing anything, whether it's the courts, whether it's a multimeter, whether it's a child, you have to ask questions, the answers to which you already know. You need to be able to compare it to a known standard, and then that tells you whether or not they're meeting the standard. You don't ask a child what's 2 plus 2 and then let their answer be the truth from that point forward. If you ask a child 2 plus 2 and they say banana, it doesn't mean 2 plus 2 is equal to banana from that point. It means the child doesn't know what 2 plus 2 is. So that means we have to look at this section. We have to break it down using logic and reason and the proper rules of grammar. And we have to decide exactly who the act does in fact apply to. Now, what we're going to do, first of all, let's realize this. This is a section called application, and instead of coming right out and stating this act is applicable to, and then telling us clearly, specifically, and unequivocally who the act does affect, they use a whole bunch of trickery right off the bat. So what the hell is that? Are you telling me you couldn't express this without the deception? And I'll show you something. When I'm done using logic and reason, you'll see that this is only applicable to lawyers. It is not generally applicable to the public, that the Law Society has been misusing this act and misinterpreting it either purposely or ignorantly, and either one is pretty opprobrious as far as they are concerned. So let's take a boo at what it does say. It says this act does not apply to a person who is both a lawyer and a part-time judicial justice, as that term is defined in Section 1 of the Provincial Court Act in the person's capacity as a part-time judicial justice under the Act. Yada, 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 well being a justice is essentially what they're saying. Now, this act does not apply to a person. The question is, to whom does it apply? So what we're going to have to do is we have to take out this word not, and we have to rearrange it and place it someplace else. It has to make sense grammatically, and it has to be logical and reasonable. You can't just put it anywhere in the sentence where it might not even make grammatical sense. There's two places where this not can be moved to. We'll examine both. In the first one, we're going to move it right here. This act does apply to a person who is not both a lawyer and a part-time judicial justice while being a justice. Now, forgetting for a moment just how grammatically horrendous that sentence would be and how it is such twisty of language. This act does apply to a person who is not both a lawyer and a part-time judicial justice. What you end up with is the fact that it's applicable to lawyers and non-lawyers, but it's applicable to non-lawyers regardless of whether or not they're a judicial justice. Now, the second place where it could go is here. This act does apply to a person who is both a lawyer and not a part-time judicial justice. Now we get a different picture, an entirely different picture as to who the act is originally applicable to. So let's take a look at it. I'll show you what I mean. So for the purpose of this logical analysis, the populace can be divided into four basic groups. You have those who are lawyers and those who are not lawyers. You have those who are JPs and those who are not JPs. So the first one, lawyer and a JP. We know it says this act does not apply to a person who is both a lawyer and a part-time judicial justice. So this is the given. This is what we know. Regardless of what the situation is, this must remain true. It is not applicable to a lawyer while they are acting as a JP. The question is, to whom else is it applicable? Now, one of the things that we have to look out for, and which will tell us that it's an unacceptable outcome, is if there is a discrepancy between this JP and this JP. Some of them are drawn from a pool of lawyers, some of them are drawn from the public. In order for the court's claim of independence and impartiality to be maintained, these have to remain identical. So let's go through it. If we move the word not in the first case to read this act does apply to a person who is not both a lawyer and a part-time judicial justice, yada yada, what we end up with is that it is applicable against a lawyer who is not a JP, which I believe it should be. It is, after all, the Legal Profession Act. It is, however, also applicable to members of the public who are not JPs, and it is still applicable to members of the public even when they are acting as JPs. So what this means is that in this case right here, you have the JP being bound, and here you have the JP not being bound, the only difference being one was drawn from the legal profession and one was not. This discrepancy is unacceptable. It's unacceptable due to logic and reason, because for them to be independent, impartial, and fair, they have to be equally free and equally burdened. Now on the other side, if we change it to read, this act does apply to a person who is both a lawyer and not a part-time judicial justice, yada, 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 what do we end up with? We end up that, is it applicable to a lawyer and a JP? No, it is not. Is it applicable against a lawyer who is not a JP? Yes, it is. Is it applicable against a member of the public, someone who's not a lawyer and not a JP? No, it is not. Is it applicable against a member of the public who is acting as a JP? No, it is not. What you end up with is no discrepancy between the two JPs. This JP is not affected by it. He's a lawyer, but guess what? Because he's a JP, he's not affected by it. This JP is not affected by it because guess what? You're not a lawyer. You weren't covered by the act to begin with. This is the only logical outcome which does not result in a distinction being made between JPs and their burdens and freedoms based upon whether or not they're drawn from the Law Society. And if you look at it, it makes perfect sense too, and you can understand why the lawyers want number one so bad is because it binds everyone. As far as the whip goes, they're the ones holding the handle, and in this case, they're the ones who don't hold the handle and they're bound by the sharp, pointy, sticky end. So this is why they argue so much for this. But here's the thing, their argument is they need to be able to monopolize the court and control the practice of law, to regulate the practice of law for the benefit of the public, to protect the public from those who are incapable of doing things like properly interpreting statutes. But if I'm right about Section 1 of this Act, then that means they are either incapable, the whole lot of them, of interpreting this one section of this one Act, the first and foremost one they should be looking at. They've misinterpreted that, or they have purposely relied upon deception to engage in what is it's a massive fraud. And those people who allowed it to happen, the people at the top of the Law Society, they should lose everything they have and go to jail for 14 years for hijacking our courts by misrepresenting what the application of this main act is all about. So that's what it boils down to. Either the judge, when we test the court, is going to have to choose to whom is it applicable. Is it generally applicable to everyone, in which case it's applicable to judicial justices of the peace who are drawn from the public, but not those who are drawn from the Law Society, or is it not generally applicable, which would be kind of amazing from a Freeman perspective, wouldn't it? What's that? A statute that's not just generally and automatically applicable? Go figure. And this is the only one, number 2 is the only one that maintains the same level of freedom, independence, and impartiality between members of the judiciary. So if they decide to go with number 2, it means that they're giving up any claim whatsoever that the courts are independent, impartial, and fair, that they are in fact even a proper judicial system. At that point, we have the right to destroy them for their lack of impartiality. That would be a little crack that anyone who wanted to could put a chisel in there and destroy their entire structure. That little discrepancy between how they treat these two different judicial justices of the peace would highlight the deception and the fact that the Law Society has hijacked these courts. If he finds, however, in favor of number 2, then what that evidence is that the Law Society has been fucking us all for a long time. Any orders that they sought from the Supreme Court of British Columbia by relying upon their interpretation of that section would have to be rendered null and void because they relied upon an act that wasn't applicable. The people who sought those actions would likely be personally liable, and we could bring a class action lawsuit against the entire Law Society for stealing our courts. So what I'm going to do is we're going to be going to court and seeking a judicial determination on the application of the Legal Profession Act. Is it generally applicable to the public, in which case public and JP are covered, are subject to it, or is it not generally applicable, in which case the independence and impartiality of the judiciary is maintained? I want to see what they have to say about that.